The dawn over the channel smelled of cold oil and salt, and the sky behaved like an instrument that would decide who moved and who did not. That single, simple fact, control of the air became control of movement on the ground, threads these machines and men together, and it is what turns a catalogue of airplanes into a story about survival, timing, and the slow, mechanical dismantling of an enemy's ability to fight. As 1944 opened, Allied skies were crowded with choices. By the summer, 5 fighters, each forged by different needs and personalities of war, would shape the tempo of operations from the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruined bridges of the Low Countries, converting speed and firepower into a relentless denial of mobility for Axis forces. A young pilot strapped into a Supermarine Spitfire felt the engine's heartbeat against his ribs and knew immediacy. In Europe, the Spitfire was the scalpel, surgical and quick, able to outturn opponents in battles where a degree or two of angle meant life or death. But by 1944 it was more than that graceful turner. The British had learned to push Merlin engines and fit clipped wings for low-altitude riposte, transforming the Spitfire into a hunter of ground columns as well as fighters. The sensory memory a pilot would later recall, smell of burnt varnish, the iron taste when adrenaline clamped the throat as rounds stitched across the fuselage, came from sorties flown low over English fields, watching smoke columns rise from an isolated German convoy, and knowing that the next pass could stop its engines forever. The Spitfire's contribution was not only victory in the air, it was a psychological hammer, breaking the confidence of commanders who suddenly found their roads and railheads impious under a sky that could not be tamed. Across the Atlantic, another kind of inevitability unfolded. Long-range escort was a promise that bomber crews had craved since the first strategic raids. The P-51 Mustang arrived like an answer to a prayer, but its importance ran deeper than range alone. Engineers had found a way, through radiator placement and careful aerodynamic shaping, not simply to carry extra fuel, but to make the radiator duct contribute thrust, a curious aerodynamic benefit later called the Meredith effect. That meant the Mustang could race ahead and come home without surrendering speed or altitude, shadowing 4 engine bombers and turning the sky into a protective corridor rather than an exposed road. Bomber crews learned to sleep a little between missions when a P-51 group hovered nearby. Their fear of solitary darkness at high altitude diminished. The Mustang might have given the Allies the right to finish a raid, but it also altered the calculus of German fighter tactics, forcing interceptors to chase when they would have preferred ambush. On the carriers and in the Pacific, the F-6F Hellcat cultivated a different narrative, one of resilience and simplicity. Fleet pilots who walked across its aluminum skin found a cockpit that forgave mistakes, a machine that could eat hits and keep flying. Against the Mitsubishi Zeros, Hellcats racked up kills because their design accepted the rough edges of carrier operations and pilot inexperience as variables to be neutralized by ruggedness. What sailors and airmen sometimes overlooked in the heat of combat was that the Hellcat's triumph was not just mechanical, it was organizational. Grumman's production line and the Navy's training cycle synchronized in 1944 so that replacements arrived quickly, not as fragile prototypes, but as proven survivors. Men who had been terrified of carrier landings a month earlier suddenly trusted an airplane enough to push into fights and come back with holes and stories, which, when traded in mess halls, hardened the resolve of the next generation boarding the deck. The Republic 47. Thunderbolt cut a silhouette of contradiction. Massive, yet surprisingly agile at low altitudes, designed with a turbocharged engine meant for high-altitude escort, yet often employed as a ground pounder. Its tenacious radial engine required space, and that bulk, meant it could carry ordnance in a way few fighters could. Field commanders learned to exploit that endurance. Thunderbolts could loiter above a target, and then, with a roar, dive and scatter a column of tanks with rockets and machine gun fire. Pilots who had once chased air-to-air glory found themselves in a new role, part of the combined arms choreography that made breakout possible. The Thunderbolt's contribution was not just firepower, but the way it forced German units to hide, to move only at night, to accept delays that rippled into strategic paralysis. And there was the F-4U Corsair, a jagged winged bird whose early carrier troubles had almost written it out of the Navy's story, only to be reclaimed by Marine squadrons operating from small forward fields. When Corsair pilots returned from strafing runs on German supply dumps, their faces were smeared with fuel and grit. When they told of the aircraft pulling through with shattered canopies, the men on the ground believed in the machine differently. The Corsair taught a hard lesson about adaptation. An airplane relegated because of landing quirks became a tool of terror against itinerary convoys when placed in the hands of crews who would operate from shorter fields and in closer support. The shift from carrier embarrassment to frontline enabler illustrates how doctrine and creative desperation reshaped raw performance into decisive advantage. Hidden inside these broad arcs are small, stubborn truths that change the way a veteran reads the sky. Pilots discovered that radiator ducting could double as propulsion, that armor plate placement could save lives more than lighter weight, that a roof of flak made high-altitude formations nearly helpless without escort, and that certain designs, built for endurance or for ruggedness, would find their natural vocation not in some original blueprint, but in the desperate improvisations of combat. There were production bottlenecks, too. Factories could churn out airframes, but trained pilots could not be replaced overnight, which is why tactical adjustments, deploying Spitfires in low sweeps, sounding Thunderbolts for interdiction instead of escort, mattered so much. The men on the ground felt it as a tightening noose. Logistics officers felt it as consternation. Frontline commanders felt it as leverage. The climax comes during the summer campaign that followed the landings on the Normandy beaches, when Allied fighters coalesced into a weapon of denial. German columns trying to retreat or reinforce found themselves run down by aircraft that arrived with terrifying regularity. A Thunderbolt loadout of rockets and machine gun fire could stop a Panzer Grenadier battalion in its tracks. A flight of Mustangs could appear over a bridge only to find its spans collapsing under weight of incendiaries and strafing runs. Spitfires, Corsairs, and Hellcats hunted transports and motorcycles, shredding supply lines with a precision that turned local engagements into strategic consequences. The sound of a fighter engine approaching became synonymous with dread. Soldiers on the road learned to lie flat in ditches and pray. Commanders learned to fear moving during daylight. That concentrated interdiction was the high-intensity moment where machinery, training, and doctrine converged to break an enemy's ability to maneuver. When the smoke cleared, the cost was clear. Pilots who had trusted these machines paid with flesh and bone, and factories that had produced them had sometimes outpaced the grim math of human losses. The final reckoning is not a tally of victories, but a recognition that Allied fighters in 1944 did more than win dogfights. They deprived the enemy of the most precious military commodity, the ability to move when and where they wished. That denial accelerated collapse, shortened campaigns, and saved lives on the scale of battalions and divisions, even as individual crews paid the ultimate price. Years later, veterans would still feel the sensation of a Merlin or a Packard Merlin leaping to life beneath their knees. A familiar engine note like a memory of steel and loss. The takeaway is simple and uncomfortable. Air superiority meant more than supremacy in the sky. It became the means by which an industrial alliance strangled an opponent's logistics, and in that mechanical strangulation, the war in Europe reached its final chapters.